The sirens wailed through Maple Ridge Estates as Margaret Whitmore's trembling finger pressed send on her third 911 call in an hour. Behind her perfectly manicured hedges, the Rodriguez family's pool party had crossed every line she'd drawn in the sand. But when the police cruiser rolled up, badges gleaming in the afternoon sun, something unexpected happened. Officer Mike Chen didn't reach for his handcuffs, he reached for a burger. What started as Margaret's ultimate power play was about to become the most humiliating defeat of her HOA reign, and the entire neighborhood was about to discover that sometimes, calmer comes. The bass thumped through the ground like a heartbeat, each beat sending Margaret Whitmore's blood pressure climbing another notch. She stood at her kitchen window, gripping her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles had gone white, watching the absolute chaos unfolding in the backyard next door. "This is it," she whispered to herself, her voice sharp with vindication. "This is exactly what I warned the board about." The Rodriguez family had moved into 47 Maple Ridge Drive 6 months ago, and from day one, Margaret had known they were trouble. Not the kind of trouble you could put your finger on. Carlos Rodriguez was a decorated veteran who worked as a high school principal, and his wife Elena was a nurse at the Children's Hospital. Their twin daughters, Sophia and Isabella, were honor roll students who said please and thank you more than most adults Margaret knew. But they were allowed. They were vibrant. They were everything that Maple Ridge Estates, with its pristine lawns and whispered conversations, was not supposed to be. And today, they had crossed every line. Margaret's eyes swept over the scene with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield. The pool was packed with at least 30 people, a clear violation of the HOA's gathering size limit of 15. Children were running around the deck without adult supervision, their wet feet leaving puddles on the concrete. The music was definitely above the 65 decibel limit she'd personally lobbied to have written into the community guidelines. But worst of all, they had erected a bounce house. A garish, rainbow-colored bounce house that jutted into the sky like a middle finger aimed directly at everything Margaret had worked to preserve in their community. "No permit," she muttered, pulling out her phone to document the violation. No advance notice to neighbors. Complete disregard for property values. She snapped photo after photo, each click of her camera app punctuating her growing rage. Through her zoom lens, she could see Carlos manning a grill that was sending smoke drifting toward her prized rose garden. Elena was laughing with a group of women, her hands gesticulating wildly as she told some story that had everyone in stitches. The twins were leading a group of children in what appeared to be an impromptu water balloon fight. It was bedlam. It was chaos. It was exactly the kind of thing that would turn their peaceful neighborhood into some kind of carnival. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her friend Dorothy, who lived 3 houses down. "Can hear the music from here. This is getting out of hand." Another buzz, this time from Harold across the street, counted 17 cars parked on our street. "This is a residential area, not a parking lot." Margaret smiled grimly. She wasn't alone in this. The concerned residents of Maple Ridge Estates were finally seeing what she'd been trying to tell them for months. She dialed the non-emergency police line, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Maple Ridge Police Department, how can I help you? This is Margaret Whitmore at 45 Maple Ridge Drive. I need to report a noise violation and an unpermitted gathering at the residence next door. Can you tell me more about the nature of the disturbance?" Margaret's voice took on the crisp, authoritative tone she'd perfected during her 15 years as HOA president. "The residents are hosting a party that clearly exceeds our community's gathering limits. The music is well above acceptable decibel levels, and they've erected an unpermitted structure on their property. There are also numerous parking violations on our street." "And what time did this disturbance begin?" Margaret glanced at her watch. "Approximately noon. It's now 2:30 p.m. and the situation has only escalated. We'll send an officer to take a look. Thank you for calling." Margaret hung up with satisfaction, already anticipating the look on Carlos Rodriguez's face when the police arrived. She tried to handle this the proper way, through HOA channels, through neighborly conversation, through written warnings. But some people only understood authority when it came with a badge. She returned to a window, positioning herself behind the sheer curtains where she could observe without being seen. The party was in full swing now. She watched as Carlos's brother Miguel, who she'd specifically told Elena was not welcome at community events after he'd had the audacity to question her authority at the last HOA meeting, cannonballed into the pool, sending a massive splash across the deck. Absolutely no regard for property, Margaret muttered, making a note in her phone. Water damage to deck, potential liability issues. But as she watched, something else caught her attention. Mrs. Chen from down the street was walking up the Rodriguez's driveway, carrying what appeared to be a covered dish. Margaret's stomach clenched. Mrs. Chen was one of the few neighbors who'd remained neutral in Margaret's ongoing disputes with the Rodriguez family. "Oh no," Margaret whispered. "Not you too." She watched in horror as Elena Rodriguez greeted Mrs. Chen with a warm hug, accepting the dish with obvious gratitude. Within minutes, Mrs. Chen was seated at a patio table, laughing with a group of women while one of the twins brought her a plate of food. This was exactly what Margaret had feared. The Rodriguez family's complete disregard for community standards was spreading like a virus, infecting previously reasonable neighbors with their chaos. Her phone rang. It was Dorothy. "Margaret, I can see from my window that Linda Chen just went over there with a casserole." "I saw it too," Margaret replied grimly. "This is exactly what I warned the board about. First they ignore the rules. Then they start influencing other residents." "Are you calling the police?" "Already did. They should be here any minute." "Good. Someone needs to put a stop to this before it gets completely out of hand." Margaret hung up and resumed her surveillance. The sun was beating down mercilessly, and she could see that someone had set up a misting system around the patio area. Another violation: outdoor water usage during peak hours was strictly regulated in their community. She took more photos, building her case with the methodical precision of a prosecutor. Each image captured another violation, another example of the Rodriguez family's complete disregard for the standards that made Maple Ridge Estates a desirable place to live. But then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Harold Morrison from across the street was walking toward the Rodriguez house, carrying a cooler. Harold, who had been her most reliable ally in maintaining community standards. Harold, who had seconded her motion to ban lawn decorations during the previous HOA meeting. "What are you doing?" Margaret whispered, pressing her face closer to the window. She watched in disbelief as Harold was greeted with the same warm enthusiasm as Mrs. Chen. Within moments, he was sitting by the pool, his pants rolled up to his knees, his feet dangling in the water like some kind of teenager. Margaret's phone buzzed with another text from Dorothy. "Harold just went over there too." "What's happening?" Before Margaret could respond, she saw Dorothy herself walking across the street, carrying what appeared to be a basket of something. Margaret's mouth fell open in shock. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered. This was a disaster. This was exactly the kind of neighborhood deterioration she'd been fighting against for years. The Rodriguez family's complete disregard for community standards was spreading like wildfire, turning previously reasonable residents into whatever this was. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? This is Margaret Whitmore at 45, Maple Ridge Drive. I need police assistance immediately. There's a large, unpermitted gathering next door that's getting out of control. Can you describe the nature of the emergency? The residents are hosting an illegal gathering with loud music, unpermitted structures, and numerous code violations. The situation is escalating and affecting multiple residents. Is anyone in immediate danger? Margaret paused, watching as one of the twins helped an elderly man she didn't recognize navigate the steps into the pool. Well, no, not immediate danger, but we'll send an officer to investigate. If there are no immediate safety concerns, it may take some time for an officer to arrive. Some time. Margaret's voice rose. I called over an hour ago and nothing has happened. I understand your frustration. We'll have an officer there as soon as possible. Margaret hung up in frustration, her hands shaking with rage. She'd followed every proper channel, documented every violation, and still the chaos continued to spread. Through her window, she could see that the party had now expanded to include at least half the street. Her own neighbors, people she'd worked with for years to maintain community standards, were fraternizing with the enemy. She picked up her phone again, this time calling her friend Janet, who lived in the next development over but served on the county zoning board. Margaret's alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m., but she was already awake, her mind racing through the battle plan she'd been perfecting since the moment Officer Chen had waved at her window. She'd spent the night making lists, researching ordinances, and calling in favors from contacts she'd cultivated over decades of community involvement. By 6 a.m., she was dressed in her most authoritative outfit, a navy blazer that had served her well through countless HOA meetings, and sitting at her kitchen table with her phone, her laptop, and a stack of printed documents that would have impressed a law firm. Her first call was to Janet at the county zoning board. "Margaret, it's early," Janet's voice was thick with sleep. "Janet, I need you to expedite a zoning inspection for 47 Maple Ridge Drive. The residents erected an unpermitted structure yesterday, and I have photographic evidence." "What kind of structure?" "A bounce house. Commercial grade, clearly exceeding residential use parameters." Janet sighed. "Margaret, bounce houses for private parties don't typically require permits unless they are permanent installations. This one was up for over 8 hours. How is that not permanent?" I'll see what I can do." "But Margaret, you might want to consider whether this is really worth it," Margaret cut her off. "Community standards exist for a reason." Her second call was to the city's noise enforcement division. Her third was to the fire marshal's office. Surely that many people gathered around a grill violated some kind of fire safety code. By 7 a.m., she had filed formal complaints with 4 different municipal departments. But Margaret's masterstroke was her call to councilman Bradley Walsh, whose campaign she'd supported with both donations and volunteer hours. "Brad, it's Margaret Whitmore. I need your help with a situation that's gotten completely out of hand." "Margaret, good to hear from you. What can I do?" "There's a family in my neighborhood that's systematically violating every community standard. We have. Yesterday they hosted an illegal gathering that drew complaints from multiple residents, and when the police arrived, they completely failed to enforce any ordinances." "That sounds frustrating. What kind of violations are we talking about?" Margaret launched into her prepared presentation, complete with timestamps and documentation. She painted a picture of chaos and disorder, of property values under threat, of a neighborhood in decline. "And the worst part, Brad, is that this isn't isolated. These people have been pushing boundaries since the day they moved in. If we don't take action now, every resident in Maple Ridge Estates will think they can ignore community standards." "I understand your concerns, Margaret. Let me make some calls, see what can be done." Margaret hung up with satisfaction. Bradley Walsh showed her favors, and he was up for re-election next year. He couldn't afford to ignore a constituent complaint, especially one from someone with her connections. By 8 a.m., she was ready for phase 2 of her campaign. Margaret had lived in Maple Ridge Estates longer than anyone else on the street. She knew every resident's schedule, their pets' names, their family dynamics. She knew exactly who to call and what to say to build the coalition she needed. Her first stop was Dorothy's house. "I've been thinking about yesterday," Dorothy said, pouring coffee into Margaret's favorite mug. "Maybe we were too hasty calling the police. They seemed to be having a nice time." Margaret felt a chill of alarm. "Dorothy, you can't be serious. That party was a clear violation of at least 6 community guidelines." "But Margaret, nobody was getting hurt. The children were having fun, the adults were being responsible. Maybe we should be more flexible about flexible." Margaret's voice rose. "Dorothy, you've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years. You've seen what happens when people start ignoring community standards. Property values decline, the wrong element moves in, and before you know it, we're living in chaos." Dorothy looked uncomfortable. "I just think maybe we should try to get along with them. They seem like nice people." "Nice people follow the rules, Dorothy. Nice people don't throw parties that disturb the entire neighborhood." Margaret left Dorothy's house with a sick feeling in her stomach. If Dorothy was wavering, how many other neighbors were falling under the Rodriguez family spell? Her next stop was Harold Morrison's house across the street. Harold answered the door in his bathrobe, his hair disheveled. "Margaret, it's early. Is everything all right?" "Harold, I need to ask you something directly. Are you planning to support the Rodriguez family's continued violations of our community standards?" Harold frowned. "Margaret, I don't know what you mean by support. I went to their party yesterday because Elena invited me. It was nice. I haven't had that much fun in months." "Fun?" Margaret stared at him. "Harold, you seconded my motion to ban lawn decorations. You've been one of my most reliable allies in maintaining community standards. How can you suddenly abandon everything we've worked for?" "I'm not abandoning anything, Margaret. But yesterday made me realize something. Maybe we've been too focused on rules and not enough on community." Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet again. Community is built on shared standards. Harold. Without rules, we don't have community, we have chaos. Maybe a little chaos isn't such a bad thing. Margaret left Harold's house in a state of near panic. Two of her most reliable allies were defecting. This was worse than she'd imagined. But Margaret hadn't survived 15 years as HOA president by giving up at the first sign of resistance. She had other resources, other allies who understood. What was at stake? Her phone rang as she walked back to her house. It was Bradley Walsh. "Margaret, I made some calls about your situation. The good news is that we can send code enforcement out to take a look. The bad news is that most of what you described falls under civil HOA matters, not municipal violations." "What about the noise complaints?" "We can investigate those, but only if they are actively occurring. If your neighbors have another party, call immediately and we'll send someone out with a decibel meter." Margaret's spirits lifted slightly. "And the unpermitted structure? If they put up another temporary structure without proper permits, we can cite them." "But Margaret, I have to ask, are you sure this is the hill you want to die on?" "Sometimes. It's better to try to work with neighbors rather than against them. Brad, I've been trying to work with them for 6 months. They've ignored every attempt at reasonable compromise." "All right, I'll back you up. But be careful, Margaret. This kind of neighborhood dispute can get ugly fast." Margaret hung up feeling vindicated. She had official support now. The Rodriguez family's reign of chaos was about to end. But as she reached her front door, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There was a piece of paper taped to her door, not tucked into the doorframe or placed in her mailbox, but taped directly to the wood. With trembling hands, she pulled it off and read, "Dear Margaret, thank you for calling the police yesterday. Officer Chen is a wonderful man, and we enjoyed meeting him. He suggested we organize a neighborhood block party next weekend to bring everyone together. We hope you'll join us. Your neighbors, the Rodriguez family." Margaret crumpled the note in her fist. They were taunting her. They were actually taunting her, using her own complaint against her to organize an even bigger violation. She stormed into her house and immediately called the police department. "I need to speak to Sergeant Rodriguez immediately." "Sergeant Rodriguez is in a meeting. Can I take a message?" "This is Margaret Whitmore at 45 Maple Ridge Drive. Your officer, Chen, not only failed to enforce the law yesterday, but is now actively encouraging my neighbors to violate community standards." "I'm not sure what you mean." "Officer Chen suggested they organize a block party." "A block party? In a residential neighborhood with clear gathering restrictions?" Community policing officers often suggest positive community engagement activities. Is there a specific law being violated?" Margaret wanted to scream. "They are planning to violate every community standard we have. If you have concerns about a future event, you can file a complaint when it occurs. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Margaret hung up in frustration. The entire system was working against her. The police, the municipal officers, even her own neighbors were abandoning the standards that made their community worth living in. But Margaret had one more card to play. One that she'd been saving for exactly this kind of situation. She opened her laptop and began typing, to all Maple Ridge Estates residents from Margaret Whitmore, HOA President. Subject, Emergency Community Meeting, immediate action required. Dear residents, I am calling an emergency HOA meeting for tonight at 7 p.m. in the community center. We are facing an unprecedented threat to our community standards and property values. As many of you witnessed yesterday, the residents of 47 Maple Ridge Drive hosted an illegal gathering that violated multiple community guidelines. Despite numerous complaints, local authorities failed to take appropriate action. More concerning, these residents are now planning to organize a block party next weekend, which would represent a complete abandonment of the standards that have made our community a desirable place to live. I am asking every resident who cares about maintaining our community's character to attend tonight's meeting. We need to present a united front against this threat to our neighbor. Margaret's phone rang at 6:30 a.m., jolting her from the restless sleep she'd finally managed after hours of staring at the ceiling. The caller ID showed Bradley Walsh's office number. Margaret, we have a problem. Margaret sat up in bed instantly. Alert. What kind of problem? I got a call from the city attorney's office this morning. Apparently, you've filed 17 separate complaints against the same address in the past 24 hours. 17, Margaret. And they are calling it harassment. The Rodriguez family has filed a counter-complaint claiming you're using municipal resources to wage a personal vendetta. Margaret's blood ran cold. That's ridiculous. I'm documenting legitimate violations. Margaret, you filed a complaint about their garden gnome. A garden gnome? The fire marshal's office got 3 separate calls from you about a backyard barbecue that ended 8 hours before you called. Community standards exist for a reason, Brad. Not if enforcing them lands you in legal trouble. Margaret, I'm advising you as a friend, you need to step back from this. Way back. Margaret hung up feeling like the walls were closing in. But instead of deterring her, Bradley's warning only confirmed what she'd suspected all along: the Rodriguez family had connections, influence, the ability to manipulate the system in their favor. She needed to be smarter, more strategic. She needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Margaret spent the morning researching property records, diving deep into municipal databases she'd never explored before. If the Rodriguez family thought they could outsmart her, they were about to learn exactly who they were dealing with. By noon, she'd found what she was looking for. The previous owner of 47 Maple Ridge Drive had applied for a permit to install a hot tub in 2019. The permit had been approved but never finalized, meaning any permanent modifications to the backyard might be in violation of the original property specifications. Margaret grabbed her camera and headed for her backyard, positioning herself where she could get the best view of the Rodriguez property. Through her telephoto lens, she could see that they'd installed landscape lighting around the pool area, built a small storage shed near the back fence, and created what appeared to be a permanent patio extension, none of which appeared on the original property plans. Margaret's heart raced as she documented each potential violation. This wasn't about noise complaints or party guests. This was about structural modifications that could affect property values throughout the neighborhood. She was so focused on her photography that she didn't notice the shadow falling across her yard until a voice spoke behind her. That's a really nice camera. Margaret spun around to find Carlos Rodriguez standing at her back fence, his hands resting casually on the wooden slats. He was wearing work clothes and had paint on his fingers, apparently doing some kind of home improvement project. What are you doing on my property? Margaret demanded. I'm not on your property, Carlos said calmly. I'm standing in my own backyard. But I couldn't help noticing you've been taking a lot of pictures of our house lately. Margaret felt heat rising in her cheeks. I'm documenting violations of community standards. Margaret, can I ask you something? And I mean this genuinely, what are you hoping to accomplish? I'm trying to preserve the character of this neighborhood. Carlos studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. You know what I see. When I look at this neighborhood, I see houses where people live, but they don't really know each other. I see neighbors who wave politely but never talk. I see a community that's so focused on maintaining appearances that it's forgotten how to be alive. There's nothing wrong with maintaining standards. No, there isn't. But there's something wrong with using standards as weapons. Margaret lifted her camera again, trying to focus on the shed she was documenting. I don't know what you mean. Margaret, yesterday my daughter Sophia asked me why the lady next door doesn't like us. She wanted to know if we'd done something wrong, if there was something we could do to fix it. And you know what I told her? Margaret lowered her camera, despite herself. I told her that sometimes people are so afraid of change that they fight against anything different, even when that difference might make things better. Your family's disregard for community standards isn't making anything better. Carlos was quiet for a long moment. Margaret, my wife, is a pediatric nurse. She spends her days helping sick children. My daughters volunteer at the animal shelter every weekend. I coach Little League for kids whose parents can't afford the equipment fees. We are not the enemy you think we are. This isn't personal, Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Carlos asked gently. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've declared war on my family for the crime of trying to be happy in our own home. Margaret raised her camera again, but her hands were shaking. I have work to do. Margaret, Carlos said, and something in his tone made her look at him again. My mother-in-law is flying back to Mexico tomorrow. She's 83 years old. And this might be the last time she sees her granddaughters. Tonight we are having a small family dinner to say goodbye. Just family, no music, no crowds, nothing that violates any of your rules. Margaret waited for him to continue. Elena wanted me to invite you. She thinks you might be lonely, that maybe if you got to know us as people instead of problems, we could find a way to be neighbors. I'm not lonely, Margaret said automatically. Okay, Carlos said. But the invitation stands. 6 o'clock. Just dinner and conversation. He turned to walk back toward his house, then paused. Margaret, I know you think we don't respect this community. But we bought this house because we wanted to raise our daughters somewhere safe and stable. We want the same things you do. We just have different ideas about how to get there. Margaret watched him walk away, her camera hanging uselessly around her neck. For a moment, just a moment, she felt a crack in the certainty that had sustained her for so long. But then she looked at the photos on her camera, the evidence of violations that could be dismissed if she didn't act quickly. She thought about the 17 complaints Bradley had mentioned about being accused of harassment when all she was doing was enforcing the rules. Margaret went inside and called the municipal zoning office directly. This is Margaret Whitmore. At 45 Maple Ridge Drive. I need to report unpermitted structural modifications to the property next door. Are you the same Margaret Whitmore who's filed multiple complaints about this address? I am. And this time I have evidence of actual zoning violations, not just community guidelines. I'm going to transfer you to our supervisor. Margaret was put on hold for several minutes before a new voice came on the line. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Director Patterson. I understand you have concerns about your neighbors. I have evidence of unpermitted structural modifications that may violate the original property specifications. Mrs. Whitmore, we take zoning violations seriously. But we also take harassment complaints seriously. I'm going to send an inspector out to take a look, but I need to inform you that if this complaint proves to be unfounded, we'll be adding it to the file the Rodriguez family has started. What file? The harassment file. If the pattern continues, they may pursue legal action. Margaret felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Legal action. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to give you some free advice. Whatever's going on between you and your neighbors, you need to find a way to resolve it that doesn't involve my office. We are not a mediation service, and we are not going to be used as a weapon in a neighborhood dispute. The line went dead. Margaret sat in her kitchen, staring at her phone. Legal action. The Rodriguez family was threatening legal action against her for trying to maintain community standards. She looked out her window at the house next door, where she could see Elena in the kitchen, apparently preparing for the family dinner Carlos had mentioned. Through the window, Margaret could see Elena's mother, a tiny woman with silver hair pulled back in a bun, sitting at the kitchen table, watching her daughter cook with obvious pleasure. For a moment, Margaret imagined what it would be like to walk next door, to accept the invitation, to sit at that table and share a meal with people who weren't enemies or allies, just neighbors. But then she remembered the 17 complaints, the accusations of harassment, the way her own neighbors had looked at her in the community center the night before. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd been saving for emergencies. Peterson Investigations, how can we help you? I need a background check, Margaret said. Comprehensive. Financial, criminal, immigration status, everything. We'll need a legitimate reason for that kind of investigation. I'm the president of a homeowners association. We are vetting residents who may pose a risk to community safety and property values. And the subject's name. Margaret took a deep breath. Carlos and Elena Rodriguez, 47, Maple Ridge Drive. She hung up feeling sick to her stomach. This wasn't what she'd wanted. This wasn't who she'd meant to become. But the Rodriguez family had forced her hand by refusing to follow the simple rules that made their community work. As evening approached, Margaret positioned herself at her kitchen window to observe the Rodriguez family dinner. She told herself she was monitoring for violations, but really sure. The investigators' report arrived 3 days later in a manila envelope that felt like it contained dynamite. Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, reading through 23 pages of the most thorough background check she'd ever seen. And it changed everything. Carlos Rodriguez wasn't just a high school principal, he was principal of the year for the entire state, recognized for turning around a failing inner-city school. Elena wasn't just a pediatric nurse, she was head of the children's cancer ward, with commendations for her work with terminal patients. The twins weren't just honor students, they were raising money for cancer research in memory of their grandfather. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the final page of the report, which detailed why the Rodriguez family had moved to Maple Ridge Estates in the first place. Elena had been receiving threatening letters at their previous address from parents who blamed her for their children's deaths in the cancer ward. The family had relocated for their safety, specifically choosing a quiet neighborhood where they could heal and rebuild their sense of security. Margaret stared at the page until the words blurred. She'd spent 6 months making their lives miserable because they hung laundry outside and played music at family gatherings. Meanwhile, they'd been trying to recover from death threats. Her phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. It was Peterson Investigations. Mrs. Whitmore, we have a problem with the surveillance you requested. Margaret's stomach clenched. What kind of problem? The subjects appear to be aware they are being watched. Yesterday, the wife approached our operative directly and offered him a bottle of water. She told him it was hot outside and he looked thirsty. She what? In 20 years of surveillance work, I've never had a subject offer my operative refreshments. It was unusual. Margaret felt heat creeping up her neck. Even when being watched by private investigators, Elena Rodriguez was being kind. There's something else, the investigator continued. We've documented their activities for 3 days now, and frankly, Mrs. Whitmore, these people are saints. Yesterday the husband spent 4 hours helping an elderly neighbor repair his fence. The wife delivered meals to 3 different families on the street. The children organized a neighborhood dog walking service and donated the money to charity. Are you telling me you can't find anything questionable in their behavior? The most suspicious thing we've observed is that they seem genuinely concerned about you. The wife has asked multiple neighbors if they think you're okay, if there's anything she can do to help improve your relationship. Margaret hung up, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet again. She'd hired investigators to find dirt on the Rodriguez family, and instead they'd found evidence that she was the problem. But Margaret had been fighting this war for too long to surrender now. If the investigators couldn't find problems with the Rodriguez family, she'd have to create them herself. She spent the morning researching HOA law, looking for any legal mechanism she could use to force compliance. What she found was a provision in their community charter that allowed for the removal of residents who consistently violate community standards despite repeated warnings and formal complaints. It was a nuclear option designed for extreme circumstances. But Margaret was running out of conventional weapons. She drafted a formal notice of violation, citing every complaint she'd filed over the past 6 months. She documented each party, each gathering, each moment of music that exceeded her interpretation of acceptable noise levels. She built a case that looked impressive on paper, even if it felt increasingly hollow in her heart. But as she was printing the final document, her doorbell rang. Margaret opened the door to find Sofia Rodriguez standing on her doorstep, holding a small wrapped package. The 12-year-old looked nervous but determined. "Hi, Mrs. Whitmore," Sofia said politely. "I wanted to give you this." Margaret took the package with trembling hands. "What is it?" "It's cookies. I made them myself. Mom taught me her grandmother's recipe." Sofia hesitated, then added, "I know you don't like us very much, but I wanted you to know that we like you. Even when you're mad at us." Margaret stared down at the girl, this child she'd been trying to force out of the neighborhood for months. "Sofia, I'm not mad at you." "Yes, you are," Sofia said matter-of-factly. "But that's okay. Mom says sometimes adults get mad when they are scared or sad, and it's not really about us." "I'm not scared or sad," Margaret said automatically. Sofia tilted her head, studying Margaret with the unnerving directness of children. "Mom says you live all by yourself, and that must be lonely sometimes. She says when people are lonely, they sometimes forget how to be happy for other people's happiness." Margaret felt tears threatening. "Your mother talks about me. She worries about you. She says you work really hard to take care of the neighborhood, but nobody takes care of you." Sofia brightened. "That's why I made cookies. To take care of you." Margaret looked down at the package in her hands. Through the clear plastic wrap, she could see perfectly formed sugar cookies decorated with careful piping. A child had spent hours making these for her. A child whose family she was trying to destroy. "Sofia," Margaret managed, "thank you." "You're welcome. And Mrs. Whitmore, if you ever want to come over for dinner, Mom makes really good enchiladas. Way better than my cookies." Sofia skipped back toward her house, leaving Margaret standing in her doorway holding homemade cookies and feeling like the worst person in the world. She went back inside and sat at her kitchen table, staring at the formal violation notice she'd been preparing. 23 pages of complaints against a family whose 12-year-old daughter was worried about her loneliness. Margaret's phone rang. It was Dorothy. "Margaret, I just wanted to let you know that Elena Rodriguez called me. She's planning a surprise birthday party for Sofia next weekend, and she wanted to make sure it wouldn't disturb you." "A birthday party?" "A small one, just family and a few friends. She asked if there were specific hours that would be best for you, or if there was anything she could do to minimize the noise." Margaret felt something break inside her chest. She called to ask permission. "Margaret, she's been calling neighbors all week, asking for advice on how to be a better neighbor to you. She genuinely wants to find a way to make this work." Margaret hung up and walked to her window. In the Rodriguez backyard, she could see Elena hanging birthday decorations on the patio, bright, cheerful streamers that would have sent Margaret into a rage just a week ago. But now all she could see was a mother trying to make her daughter's birthday special while simultaneously trying to accommodate a neighbor who'd made their lives miserable for 6 months. Margaret picked up the violation notice and stared at it for a long moment. Then she walked to a shredder and fed every page into the machine, watching months of documentation disappear into confetti. She had to end this. Not because she was wrong, she still believed in community standards, still believed in order and rules. But because she'd lost sight of why those things mattered in the first place. Community standards existed to make neighborhoods better places to live. But what was the point of preserving a community if it meant destroying the humanity that made communities worth preserving? Margaret picked up her phone and dialed Elena's number, which she'd memorized from all the complaint forms she'd filed. "Hello. Elena, this is Margaret Whitmore. There was a pause. Hi, Margaret. Is everything okay? I wanted to ask you about Sophia's birthday party. Oh. Elena's voice became cautious. Margaret, I promise we'll keep the noise to a minimum. We are planning to have everything wrapped up by 8 o'clock, and no, Margaret interrupted. I wanted to ask if there's anything I can do to help. Silence on the other end of the line. Margaret, what do you mean? I mean I've been a terrible neighbor and I'd like to do something to make up for it. If you'll let me. Margaret. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Sophia brought me cookies today and she told me you've been worried about me. No one has worried about me in longer than I can remember. Elena's voice was soft. Of course I worry about you. You're my neighbor. Margaret felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally spill over. Elena, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for the complaints, for the investigators, for making your family feel unwelcome. You didn't deserve any of it. Investigators. Elena's voice sharpened. Margaret, what investigators? Margaret realized what she'd said and felt her blood turn to ice. Oh. Elena, I can explain. You hired people to investigate my family. Elena, please, let me. The line went dead. Margaret stared at her phone in horror. She'd finally decided to make amends and instead she'd made everything infinitely worse. Elena now knew about the private investigators, knew that Margaret had crossed every line of decent behavior. Margaret grabbed her keys and ran outside, crossing to the Rodriguez house without thinking about what she'd say when she got there. She pounded on the front door, desperation making her forget about dignity or pride. Carlos answered the door. And Margaret could see immediately that Elena had told him everything. His face was a mask of controlled anger. Get off my property, he said quietly. Carlos, please, let me explain. You hired investigators to spy on my family. Margaret didn't sleep for 3 days after her confrontation with Carlos. She wandered through her house like a ghost, replaying every moment of the past 6 months, seeing her actions through new eyes that made her stomach turn with shame. On the third morning, she stood at her kitchen window watching the Rodriguez family leave for what appeared to be Sophia's birthday celebration. The twins were dressed in matching sundresses, Elena carried a carefully wrapped present, and Carlos loaded a cooler into their car with the methodical precision of a man trying to maintain normalcy for his children. Margaret noticed that Sophia looked smaller somehow, less vibrant than the confident girl who'd brought her cookies. The knowledge that she'd done that she'd stolen some spark from a 12-year-old's eyes, made Margaret feel physically sick. Her phone rang, jarring her from her self-loathing. The caller ID showed Peterson Investigations. Mrs. Whitmore, we need to discuss terminating our surveillance contract immediately. Why? Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer would only add to her shame. Yesterday the husband approached our operative directly. He didn't threaten or confront, he just walked up and said, I know Margaret hired you to watch us. She's in a lot of pain and I'm worried about her. Could you please tell her that if she needs help, she just has to ask? Margaret sank into her kitchen chair. Even after everything, the complaints, the investigators, the harassment, Carlos Rodriguez was worried about her well-being. Mrs. Whitmore, in my professional opinion, you should consider therapy. And maybe start with an apology. Margaret hung up and immediately called Peterson back to cancel the surveillance. But the damage was done. She'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, violated trust that couldn't be rebuilt. She was contemplating the ruins of her actions when her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she could see Officer Chen standing on her doorstep, but he wasn't alone. With him was a woman in a business suit whose presence immediately made Margaret's stomach clench with dread. Margaret opened the door slowly. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Officer Chen, and this is Attorney Sarah Martinez. We need to talk. Margaret's mouth went dry. Am I under arrest? No, Officer Chen said gently. But we need to discuss the situation. With your neighbors. They sat in Margaret's living room, and Attorney Martinez opened a thick folder that made Margaret think of the investigation report that had started this nightmare. Mrs. Whitmore, the Rodriguez family has asked me to deliver this message personally, Attorney Martinez began. They are prepared to file a restraining order and pursue harassment charges unless this situation ends immediately. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Harassment charges. The documented complaints, the private investigators, the systematic campaign to drive them from their home. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore, it constitutes harassment under state law. Officer Chen leaned forward, his expression kind but serious. Margaret, I've been a community policing officer for 8 years. I've seen neighborhood disputes before, but nothing like this. The Rodriguez family has shown me documentation of every complaint you filed, every interaction you've initiated. It's extensive. Margaret stared at her hands. I was trying to maintain community standards. Mrs. Whitmore, Attorney Martinez said, the Rodriguez family has also asked me to share something with you. She pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to Margaret. They wanted you to see this before we proceed with any legal action. Margaret opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were dozens of letters, handwritten thank you notes from parents whose children Elena had cared for in the hospital. Commendations for Carlos's work with underprivileged students, certificates recognizing the twins' volunteer work. But at the bottom of the stack was something that made Margaret's heart stop. It was a letter from the principal of Sophia and Isabella's school, documenting a conversation where Sophia had told her teacher she was worried about the sad lady next door who doesn't have any friends. The letter detailed Sophia's request to make extra cookies in home economics class for Mrs. Whitmore because she looks lonely. Margaret looked up at Officer Chen with tears in her eyes. Sophia asked to make me cookies at school. Mrs. Whitmore, Officer Chen said softly, this family has been worried about you from the beginning. Every complaint you filed, every confrontation you initiated, they responded with concern for your well-being. Attorney Martinez continued, the Rodriguez family wants you to understand something. They don't want to destroy you the way you've tried to destroy them. They want to offer you a choice. Margaret waited, feeling like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. Option 1, they file the restraining order and pursue full legal action. With the documentation they have, you could face significant fines, legal fees, and a permanent record that would affect your ability to serve in any HOA capacity. Margaret's stomach dropped. 15 years of community leadership, gone. Option 2, you accept responsibility for your actions and agree to mediation. You issue a formal apology to them and to the neighborhood. You step down from the HOA presidency and agree to have no further contact with their family unless absolutely necessary. And if I choose option 2, they'll consider the matter closed, Attorney Martinez said. No legal action, no restraining order. They just want to live in peace. Margaret looked around her living room, at the HOA awards on her walls, the framed photos of community events she'd organized, the certificates recognizing her years of service. All of it suddenly seemed hollow, meaningless compared to the kindness she'd rejected. There's something else, Officer Chen said. Something the Rodriguez family doesn't know I'm going to tell you. Margaret looked at him, afraid of what else she might learn. Yesterday, I was called to a domestic disturbance 3 streets over. Mrs. Patterson, elderly woman, lives alone. She'd fallen and couldn't get up, but she was too proud to call for help. Officer Chen paused. Elena Rodriguez found her when she was out walking. Elena stayed with her for 4 hours, made sure she got medical attention, arranged for neighbors to check on her. Margaret felt another piece of her heart break. Mrs. Patterson told me Elena reminded her of her own daughter, who died 5 years ago. She said Elena made her feel like she had family again. Officer Chen looked directly at Margaret. That could have been you, Margaret. You could have been the neighbor who made people feel like they had family. Margaret covered her face with her hands. I know. I know what I threw away. It's not too late, Officer Chen said gently. Not completely. But you have to choose who you want to be going forward. After Officer Chen and Attorney Martinez left, Margaret sat alone in her living room, staring at the letters from the Rodriguez family's life. Evidence of kindness, generosity, community involvement, everything she'd claimed to value but had somehow forgotten how to practice. She walked to a window and looked out at the neighborhood she'd spent 15 years trying to perfect. 4. The first time, she tried to see it through Elena's eyes, not as a collection of property values and rule compliance, but as a place where people lived and loved and struggled and needed each other. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in months. "Dorothy, it's Margaret. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Margaret, are you okay?" "You sound, Dorothy, am I a terrible person?" Silence on the other end of the line. "Dorothy?" "Margaret, you're not terrible. But you've done terrible things. And I think you know that." Margaret felt tears starting again. "I don't know how to fix this." Start with the truth, Margaret. Start by admitting that this was never about community standards. This was about you being afraid of change, afraid of people who were different, afraid of not being in control. Margaret closed her eyes. "You're right. And Margaret, if you really want to fix this, it starts with stepping down from the HOA. You've used that position as a weapon and people don't trust you with it anymore." "Oh no. There's an emergency board meeting tomorrow night. People want you out, Margaret. The question is whether you're going to go gracefully or make them force you." Margaret hung up and walked to her computer. She opened a new document and began typing, to the residents of Maple Ridge Estates, I am writing to formally announce my resignation as president of the Homeowners Association, effective immediately. Over the past 6 months, I have failed in my duty to serve this community. Instead of fostering the neighborhood values I claim to represent, I used my position to wage a personal campaign against the Rodriguez family that brought shame to our community and violated every principle of good neighborliness. The Rodriguez family are exemplary residents who have shown nothing but kindness and consideration to their neighbors. My actions against them were motivated not by legitimate concerns about community standards, but by my own fear of change and inability to accept people who were different from me. I owe them, and all of you, a sincere apology. I also owe them my commitment to never again use community resources or my position to harass or intimidate anyone. I will be seeking mediation with the Rodriguez family to make what amends I can for my behavior. I hope that in time, this community can heal from the damage I have caused. Margaret Whitmore. Margaret printed the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and